Sometimes life arrives like a sandstorm. You see it approaching on the horizon, but you never imagine what it will leave behind when it passes. Thomas Mackenzie wiped the sweat from his forehead with his shirt sleeve and looked once more at the dusty road that cut through his property. 38 years of solitude had taught him that expecting too much from anything was a mistake a man only makes once. But here he was, waiting for the third time that morning, his hands trembling and his heart beating like a 16-year-old boy waiting for his first kiss. The farm around him told the story of years of hard work and lonely nights. Every fence repaired, every barn built, every furrow planted had been made by his own hands. Thomas was not rich, but he was not in need either. He had enough cattle to sell in the city each season, a solid house he built himself board by board, and a well that never ran dry, not even in the cruelest summers Arizona had ever seen. What Thomas didn't have was someone to share it all with. Solitude had become his most faithful companion, whispering in his ears during quiet dinners and walking beside him through the empty fields. It was this same loneliness that had pushed him to write that first letter to the mail agency in San Francisco 3 months ago. His calloused hands had trembled as he clutched the quill, and he had torn 5 attempts before he could write something that didn't make him feel like a complete fool. Margaret Calloway. That was the name of the woman who had answered his letter in delicate handwriting that seemed to dance on the paper. She had written about her life in a small town in Oregon, about how she had lost her husband in an accident at the sawmill, and how her days had become too long to face alone. Her words carried a familiar sadness that Thomas immediately recognized, the same sadness that had accompanied him since he buried his parents 15 years ago. For 3 months, the letters traveled between Arizona and Oregon as messenger birds carrying pieces of 2 lonely souls. Margaret wrote about her small vegetable garden, about the books she read by candlelight, and about how she dreamed of having a family again. Thomas responded by telling him about his farm, about the mornings when the sun rose behind the mountains, painting everything gold, and about how he had built a balcony too big for one man, always hoping that one day someone would sit there next to him. The decision to marry by mail had been made in letter number 17 from Margaret. She had written that she was tired of waiting for life to happen by chance, and that sometimes a person needs to be brave enough to pursue their own happiness. Thomas had read those words at least 50 times before he sat down at his desk and wrote the most important answer of his life. A simple yes, followed by 3 pages explaining how she could get to his farm. The day of arrival had been set for that Thursday morning. Thomas had prepared himself as best he could. He had repaired the roof of the house, painted the front fence, and even bought a new dress in town, betting on the size based on Margaret's description of herself in one of her letters. He had spent the previous night awake, walking around the house and imagining what it would be like to have someone preparing coffee next to him in the morning, or listening to the sound of footsteps other than his own echoing through the rooms. But now, with the sun already high in the sky and no sign of the wagon that was supposed to bring Margaret, Thomas began to feel that familiar sensation settling in his chest. The same feeling he had felt when he had waited for his father to return from the war, or when he had waited for his mother to recover from the fever. The feeling that perhaps he had deluded himself once again, that perhaps loneliness was really his only true companion. It was then that he saw the cloud of dust forming on the horizon. Small at first, like a ghost dancing on the road, but growing with each passing second. Thomas felt his heart racing and his hands getting sweaty. He smoothed his hair, checked that his shirt was neat, and walked to the porch, trying to look casual while every muscle in his body was tense like a guitar string. The wagon first appeared as a dark spot against the blue sky, swaying and rattling along the dirt road. As he approached, Thomas could make out the figure of the coachman in the front seat, a thin man in a hat who seemed to have seen better days. But it was when the wagon stopped in front of his house that Thomas realized that something was very different from what he had planned. The first thing he noticed was the sound, not the silence he expected from a grown woman taking a long trip, but a constant buzz of small, agitated voices, children's voices, lots of kids. Thomas felt his stomach knot as the wagon door opened, and before Margaret even appeared, a curly-haired girl jumped to the ground, followed by a boy who could not have been more than 6 years old. And then another child came, and yet another, and one more. Thomas stood there, his mouth slightly open, mentally counting as little human beings continued to get out of the wagon as if it were much bigger on the inside than it appeared on the outside. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 children of ages that seemed to vary between 4 and 14 years old, all looking at him with curiosity and fatigue from the journey. It was only then that Margaret Calloway finally got off the wagon. She was just as she had described herself in her letters: brown hair tied in a simple bun, green eyes that carried stories of joy and sorrow in equal measure, and a blue dress that had seen better days, but still made her look dignified and beautiful. But what the letters had not mentioned, what Thomas had never imagined in his wildest dreams, were the 7 children who now ran around the wagon like little tornadoes of energy and curiosity. Margaret looked at Thomas for a long moment, and he could see in her eyes the same fear she felt in her own heart. The fear of having made a terrible mistake, the fear of having bet everything on a hope that was perhaps too great to come true. But there was something more to that gaze, a quiet determination that spoke of a woman who had weathered storms before and had lived to tell the tale. The coachman began to unload the family's luggage, old trunks, bags of clothes, and makeshift toys that had clearly been loved by little hands for many years. The children remained close to Margaret, forming a small army with large eyes and wary expressions, clearly waiting to see how this tall, silent stranger would react to the surprise they represented. Thomas felt the world swirl slightly around him. He had prepared to receive a wife, a companion to share his lonely life. In his wildest dreams, he had imagined that perhaps in time they could have a child or two. But 7 children, 7 little mouths to feed, 7 pairs of shoes to buy, 7 futures to secure. And it was in that moment, standing on his own balcony as his entire life changed before his eyes, that Thomas Mackenzie realized that sometimes the greatest blessings come disguised as the greatest surprises. The lone farmer had hoped for a bride, but fate had decided to send much more than that. The silence that followed was the kind that makes the air heavy, as if the world itself was waiting to see what would happen next. Thomas remained on the porch, his eyes drifting from Margaret to the children and then back to Margaret, trying to process the reality that unfolded before him like a deck of cards being shuffled by the wind. The older girl, who looked to be about 14, stepped forward. He had the same green eyes as Margaret, and a posture that spoke of someone who had grown up too fast, carrying responsibilities too heavy for his young shoulders. She held the hand of a smaller child, a light-haired boy who could not have been more than 4 years old, and looked at Thomas with a mixture of defiance and protection that he recognized immediately. It was the look of someone who had learned to defend his family, even before he knew it was necessary. Margaret finally found her voice, and when she spoke, her words ran away, as if she had rehearsed that moment hundreds of times on the trip, but now all the right words had fled her mind like frightened horses. She explained that the children were not hers by birth, but by choice. They were orphans she had taken in over the years, lost little ones who had knocked on her door or whom she had found wandering the streets of the city. Some had lost their parents in accidents, others had been abandoned by families who could no longer feed one more mouth. Each child carried their own story of loss and survival. The youngest boy, Billy, had been found sleeping behind the church on a harsh winter night. The twins, Sarah and Emma, had lost their parents in a fire and had come to Margaret thin as sticks and saplings with fear. The dark-haired boy, Jake, had worked the streets selling newspapers until a generous family referred him to Margaret when they could no longer care for him. Margaret had kept the children's secret in the letters because she knew that any sensible man would run in the opposite direction when he learned that he was marrying not just a woman, but an entire family already formed. She had bet that if Thomas met her through words first, if he fell in love with the woman before he knew the responsibilities she carried, maybe there would be a chance he'd accept the full package. Thomas listened to all this in silence, his eyes never leaving Margaret's face. He could see the fear growing in those green eyes with every word she spoke, the fear that he would send her away before she had even finished explaining. She could also see the fierce love she felt for these children, a love that had sent her across half the country in hopes of giving them a better home than anything she could offer on her own. The coachman, a man who had clearly seen many difficult farewells in his profession, stood beside the wagon, his hands ready to carry the baggage back if necessary. He said nothing, but Thomas could sense that the man was prepared to take Margaret and the children back to town if things didn't work out, without asking questions or judgments. It was then that something happened that would change everything. The younger boy, Billy, let go of the older girl's hand and walked toward Thomas with the unconscious confidence that only very young children possess. He stopped right in front of the farmer and raised his little arms, a universal gesture that needed no words to be understood. Thomas looked down at that round, dusty face from the trip, at those blue eyes that shone with pure, fearless curiosity. Something moved inside the farmer's chest, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Without a second thought, he bent down and lifted Billy into his arms, feeling the small, warm weight of the child against his chest. Billy immediately began to explore Thomas's face with his little hands, touching his rough beard and laughing at that crystalline sound that only children can make. The boy did not know that he was changing the course of several lives with his simple and innocent trust. He didn't know that his laughter was melting away years of loneliness that had accumulated in Thomas's heart, like ice on a mountain. The other children watched the interaction closely, and Thomas could feel that he was being evaluated, not by Margaret, but by those little judges who had learned too early to distinguish between adults who could be trusted and those who could not. He realized that their approval was more important than any marriage contract he might sign with Margaret. Slowly, Thomas walked with Billy, still in his arms, towards the other children. He knelt on the dusty floor, putting the boy gently to his feet, and looked into the eyes of each of the children one by one. He saw fear in some looks, cautious hope in others, and in all of them, a maturity that children should not have to carry. The older girl, whom Margaret introduced as Mary, was the first to speak. His voice was firm, but Thomas could hear the vulnerability behind the brave words. She said they weren't a burden, that they knew how to work hard, and that they didn't expect anything for free. He said that he cared for the little ones and that Margaret had taught them to be grateful for any kindness they received. Thomas felt his heart break and compose itself at the same time. Here was a child speaking like an adult, taking on responsibilities that should belong to his elders, protecting his family in the only way he knew how. He recognized in her the same spirit that had driven him to work in the field since he was 12. The same determination that had built his farm board by board. It was at that moment that Thomas Mackenzie made the most important decision of his life, not because it had been planned or because it made sense in the practical terms he had always used to guide his choices. He made the decision because sometimes the heart sees truths that the mind takes a long time to grasp. He rose slowly, his knees protesting the movement after so long on his knees, and walked over to Margaret. His eyes met hers, and for a long moment they communicated wordlessly, as if they were two people who had been lost in the desert and finally found an oasis that they both recognized as real. Thomas held out his hand to Margaret, a hand calloused by hard work and scarred by time, but firm and warm. When she placed her delicate hand on his, he felt like he was sealing not only a commitment to her, but to each of those children who had arrived as a gift, disguised as a surprise. The coachman smiled for the first time since he had arrived and began to unload his luggage with renewed enthusiasm. The children began to relax, their smiles appearing timidly like flowers blooming after a long winter. And Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to feel a relief so deep that it almost knocked her down. The farm that Thomas had built for a lone man was about to become a home for 9 people. And for the first time in his adult life, he realized that his home would finally have the sound it had always lacked, the sound of a family. The first few days of a new life always carry a different weight, as if the whole world is paying attention to see if the changes will take root or dry up like plants in unsuitable soil. Thomas quickly discovered that having 9 people living under the same roof was like learning a new language, a language made up of small gestures, meal times, and the kind of patience he had never had to develop. The house he had built for a lonely man had to be transformed almost overnight. The 2 extra rooms he used to store tools and supplies were quickly converted into dormitories. Thomas spent the first few nights on the porch, hammer in hand, building makeshift bunk beds out of the wood he had saved for other projects. Each hammer that hit the nail echoed across the plain as a silent declaration that changes were happening there. Margaret showed a quiet efficiency that impressed Thomas deeply. She organized the house as a general would organize an army, but with the kindness of someone who understood that each child needed his own space, even if it was just a small corner to call his own. The older girls, Mary and twins Sarah and Emma, shared one room, while the boys stayed in another. Billy, the youngest, was given a small crib in the room that Thomas and Margaret would share after their official wedding. The wedding took place 3 days after arrival, in the small church in the nearest town. It was a simple ceremony, with only the pastor, his wife as witnesses, and the 7 children forming the loudest congregation that church had ever seen. Thomas wore his only good suit, the one he kept for funerals and special occasions, while Margaret wore a dress that the older girls had helped sew during the trip. But it was after marriage that real life began. Thomas learned that each child had their own quirks, their own fears, and their own ways of showing love and distrust. Jake, the dark-haired boy who had sold newspapers on the streets, would wake up before dawn and stand at the window as if he was still waiting for someone to come and pick him up. The twins, Sarah and Emma, rarely separated, communicating through looks and gestures that only they understood, as if they shared a secret language born of trauma. Mary, the eldest, naturally took on the role of Margaret's helper, but Thomas could see that she carried the weight of having been responsible for the miners for too long. She watched his every move with hawkish eyes, ready to protect her adoptive siblings if he showed any sign of impatience or cruelty. This constant vigilance made Thomas sad, because he recognized in her the same caution that he himself had developed after losing his parents. The caution of one who learned that the people you love can disappear without warning. The middle boys, Tommy and David, were like 2 little hurricanes of energy. They explored every corner of the farm with the insatiable curiosity of someone who had spent too much time confined to small spaces. Thomas found them in the most unexpected situations, hanging from the roof of the barn, trying to ride the pigs, or missing for hours only to be found sleeping in the hay, exhausted from playing. And there was Billy, the 4-year-old who had won Thomas's heart from the very first moment. Billy had no memory of adults other than Margaret, so he accepted Thomas as a natural part of his life with the ease that only very young children possess. He followed the farmer through the fields, his short little legs running to keep up with Thomas's long strides, chattering about everything and nothing with that peculiar logic of small children. Margaret watched all this with a mixture of gratitude and apprehension that she tried to hide, but that Thomas could see in the quiet moments when she thought no one was looking. She had bet everything on this strange man, had put the future of 7 children in the hands of someone she knew only through letters. The courage it had required was the kind that only desperate mothers know. The courage to jump over an abyss without knowing if there is ground on the other side. The first few weeks brought challenges that Thomas had never imagined. He found that feeding 9 people was very different from feeding just one. His food reserves, which had lasted for months when he lived alone, began to dwindle rapidly. He began to make more frequent trips to the city, loading his wagon with sacks of flour, beans, and other essential supplies. Local merchants began to look at him with renewed curiosity, clearly wondering about the changes in his life. But it was the small joys that surprised Thomas the most, the sound of laughter echoing through the house during meals, the sound of footsteps running through the hallways in the morning, the way Billy ran to him when he came back from the fields, as if Thomas was the most important person in the world, the shy conversations with Mary, who gradually began to relax her constant vigilance and show the intelligent and dreamy girl who existed behind the premature responsibility. Margaret blossomed in a way that Thomas did not expect. Far from the limitations of her previous life, she showed a natural talent for transforming the house into a true home. She planted a garden behind the house, taught the girls how to sew and cook, and established routines that gave structure and security to lives that had known very little stability. The nights were perhaps the most precious moments. After the children were in bed, Thomas and Margaret would sit on the porch he had built for 2 people without even realizing it. They talked about the events of the day, about each child's progress, about plans to expand the house or improve the farm. They were simple conversations, the kind that married couples for decades have, but for Thomas, they were like small miracles. It was during one of these nightly conversations that Margaret told Thomas about her greatest fear. Not the fear that he would change his mind about them, but the fear that she had been selfish in bringing the children into a life that might be more difficult than the one they had left behind. Thomas listened in silence, understanding that sometimes people need to talk about their fears in order to move forward. He responded by telling of his own discovery, that a house full of voices and laughter was much better than a quiet house, even when it meant less sleep, more work, and challenges he had never imagined. He talked about how Billy had changed his perspective on what it meant to be responsible for someone, and how Mary had taught him that courage sometimes feels like a 14-year-old girl protecting younger children. But not everything was joys and positive discoveries. There were difficult moments, such as when Tommy had nightmares about the fire that had killed his parents, or when the twins got sick at the same time and Thomas found himself desperately running into town to get the doctor. There were also moments of frustration, when money never seemed to be enough, or when children fought among themselves with the intensity that only siblings can achieve. It was during one of these crises that Thomas realized something fundamental about the family that had formed almost by chance. He was trying to calm down a fight between Jake and David over who should feed the chickens, when Mary intervened with the natural authority of older sister. Margaret appeared with Billy on her lap, trying to distract the little one from the noise, while the twins watched everything with that quiet wisdom they seemed to share. At that moment, Thomas understood that they were no longer a lone farmer, a widow, and 7 orphans trying to start a family. They were simply a family, with all the complications, joys, and responsibilities that entailed. Love had not come like lightning, but had grown silently between them, like plants in a manicured garden. Until one day, Thomas realized that he could no longer imagine his life without that organized chaos and that constant music of young voices filling his home. 2 years later, when winter arrived earlier than expected, Thomas Mackenzie realized that he had become a completely different man from the one he had been waiting alone on his porch that Thursday morning. The snowstorm had isolated the farm for 3 days, turning the world outside into a silent white blanket. But inside the house, life continued with that warm energy that Thomas had grown to love. The children played by the fireplace. Margaret sewed while humming softly, and Billy, now 6, was curled up in Thomas's lap, listening to stories about the farm's early days. It was Mary who broke the contemplative silence of the afternoon. She approached Thomas with a paper in her hand, her eyes shining with a mixture of nervousness and determination. It was an essay she had written for the school in the city on the theme My Family. Thomas read each word carefully, feeling a lump form in his throat. Mary had written about a farmer who had chosen to love 7 strangers because he understood that family is not just blood, but also choice. She wrote about how she learned that true homes are built with patience, hard work, and a willingness to open your heart, even when it means accepting responsibilities you never planned to take on. Thomas folded the paper with slightly shaking hands and looked around the room. Jake was teaching the twins a card game, their confidence growing by the day. Tommy and David helped Margaret prepare dinner, their laughter echoing through the kitchen. And there, on his lap, Billy drew imaginary figures in the air as he made up stories about flying horses and magical farmers. The truth struck Thomas like a ray of sunshine piercing dark clouds. He had spent 38 years looking for something to complete his life, thinking he needed a wife to fill the void in his home. But fate had been wiser than his plans. He had sent not only Margaret, but an entire family that needed exactly what he had to offer: a home, stability, and a heart big enough to love unconditionally. Margaret walked over and sat next to him on the sofa that now showed signs of wear and tear from the constant use of 9 people. She placed her hand on his, that simple gesture that had become as natural as breathing. They didn't need words to communicate in those moments. They both knew they had found something rare and precious, a second chance to be happy. Outside, the storm continued, but inside the house reigned that warm peace that only true homes know. Thomas closed his eyes and listened to the sounds around him: the crackling of wood in the fireplace, the soft voices of the children talking, Margaret's silent movement around the house. They were the sounds of a full life, of a heart that had finally found its purpose. The lone farmer was gone forever that Thursday morning, when 7 children stepped out of a wagon and changed his life forever. In his place was born something far better: a father, a husband, a man who had learned that life's greatest blessings sometimes come disguised as responsibilities we never asked for, but which we gratefully accept because our hearts recognize what our minds are still trying to comprehend. And when spring came, bringing with it wild flowers and promises of new beginnings, Thomas Mackenzie planted a bigger garden than he had planned, because he now knew that some things grow better when you have more hands to care for them, more hearts to love them, and more dreams to feed them with hope. If you enjoyed this Wild West story, subscribe to the channel for more heartwarming narratives about courage, family, and second chances. Leave your like if this story touched your heart, and share it with those who need to believe that the best moments in life sometimes come when we least expect it.